The importance of contrast is often overlooked in color grading. Yet, how we think about it not only determines the quality of our work, but how we portray emotion through our work. In this video, you'll learn how to apply contrast using a clear technical framework, when you should use the HDR contrast versus primary color wheels contrast versus the curves. You'll understand why contrast goes so much deeper than just luminance values. We'll touch on color contrast, we'll touch on composition contrast, sharpness, even things like vignette are all different types of contrast. Finally, you'll leave with practical takeaways and free digital tools to help you apply everything you learn on your color grading journey. Hey guys, JMO here. Welcome back to another tutorial. Let's get into it. The human eye perceives changes in the darkness, in the darker areas, much more intensely than changes in brightness in the brighter areas. So for example, if we go from total darkness at 0% and we increase the brightness by 18%, we'll perceive that as the same increase in brightness if we go from 18% up to 100% luminance, up to 100% brightness. So it's basically how the human eye perceives changes in light. Because we perceive changes in light more dramatically in the darker regions, when we get to 18%, we essentially see that as the halfway point, 50% increase in brightness. Then when it comes to videography and photography, what we've said is we've agreed that 18% middle gray point will be our anchor. So it's really just a practical place to anchor in the midpoint when it comes to video. So when it comes to different cameras, different log profiles, different output spaces, we use this middle gray 18% as a practical anchor. It just allows us to all agree on what is the midpoint, and then we can bring that in to our editing software. And that's what I'm going to show you now. So I'll show you how we anchor that, how we find it. Middle gray will be a different value when we bring it into the digital world. So essentially we're going from the real world perception of the human eye into the digital world. And we've got all these different ways that light can be treated and manipulated inside the software. So the first thing you'll need to do so we can follow through together is if you just go ahead and go over to mononodes.com, we've got this free DCTL plugin. And this is how we basically get our middle gray point. So this is going to be important when it comes to contrast and look development and consistency. So I'll have it linked in the description below. So that being said, we are working in DaVinci wide gamut in our timeline here. So if we go back to the mono nodes and we have a look here, we can see that the middle gray as a value is different between the different log profiles and different color spaces. We'll be working in DaVinci Intermediate, which is 0.336. So if I go back to the software and go into my primary color wheels, you can see I've got my pivot point here. I'll just pull up a grayscale so you can see it as an example. And what I'll do is I'll just increase the contrast to maximum. So now you can see we've got complete contrast between black and white. So when I move this pivot point, you can see that that point between black and white actually moves. What we need to do is we need to find our 18% middle gray. Because we know that we're working inside DaVinci Intermediate, and we know that DaVinci Intermediate middle gray point is 0.336, we can go to our pivot and we can set 0.336. Now, when we make any changes in contrast, whether we increase it or decrease it, it's all going to be pivoting around that middle gray point. That's how we lock in our middle gray point. And it's relatively straightforward. Like, it doesn't have to be complicated. If you're working inside DaVinci wide gamut, all you need to know is your pivot is 0.336. That's it. That's your middle gray in DaVinci wide gamut. Now, if you want to do this in your curves, I'll show you that we can actually pull up our, let me just reset that. So that DCTL that I showed you there, the DCTL, we can drag that onto our contrast node, and then we'll just open up mono middle gray. And then we'll just go down here and find the space that we're working in, and we're working in DaVinci Intermediate. And you can see here, 0.336. Now, what's going to happen in our curves here, you'll see the histogram. You'll get this spike on the graph, which is this represented by this middle gray point. So we know that that's our middle gray. So we can lock that in. Kind of what we've done here, it's a similar principle with the pivot. 0.336 on the pivot is pretty much locking in that middle gray point. That's the technical side of it. That's how you find your middle gray. That's how you lock it in. And before you make any contrast adjustments, you need to find your middle gray and lock it. When we convert out to Rec 709, any skin tones, any mid details are going to fall around that 45 IRE, which is essentially the middle gray point. So by locking off your middle gray point in the color wheels or the curves, you're essentially locking down most skin tones and most of that mid detail. So any changes you make outside that will be mostly in the shadows and the highlights, with the detail and the contrast preserved in that middle region. That's why we do it. And then it basically means when we apply this across different shots or different looks, you're going to get a nice consistent feel and a consistent contrast across your footage. All right, let me show you a really nice way I like to bring contrast back into my image. So because we get that saturation increase in the primary color wheels when we're adjusting our contrast, if I go into my contrast node here, get that pivot 0.336, what I like to do is I'll drop my saturation to 0. And now the image, we're just working with complete tonal ranges. So we're working with highlights in the sky, mid-tone details in the skin, and then shadows for the hair. We're only looking at tonal ranges without the distraction of color and any increases or decreases if we're decreasing contrast in the saturation. Let's start dialing in our contrast. So if I start to pull down the lift, you can see we're getting a nice response. We'll bring up the gain. You can just start working with your image until you're satisfied and happy with the amount of contrast you want to bring into it. You know, everyone's going to have different preferences, different amounts of contrast they want. You know, more contrast, more drama, more mood, less contrast, more of a soft filmic feel. Let's get it about there. So let's say we're happy with that. We've got a nice amount of contrast now in the scene. So what I'll start doing now, instead of putting the saturation slider back to 50 where we started, what we can do is we can start to increase saturation by sliding it up and slowly bringing the saturation back into the scene. I'm actually pretty happy with that instead of 50, where 50 looks okay, but it's maybe a little bit over. I like it a little bit under, so I'm just going to bring it back down to where we were. And if I do before and after, I'm pretty happy with how that's looking. So that's pretty much, it's a nice little trick to dial in contrast, because contrast, you're really just looking at luminance values, right? Unless you're doing color work or, you know, you're trying to play with color and contrast colors. But for the luminance contrast, it is good just to decrease the saturation, get into those tonal zones and start manipulating that way. Next, we'll go into our curves, and then again, DCTL, pull up the mono middle gray, down to DaVinci Intermediate, and lock in this point. So once you've locked it in, you can actually just turn off the DCTL. And now we can start using our curves here to dial in some contrast. So what I'll do is if I go to these three dots and press editable splines, now we can actually just pull these curves and start to bring contrast into the image. You can see that we've locked down that middle gray point. So nothing in this area is moving in terms of the contrast. Just bring up the highlights and then just lift that up. And we can do before and after. And there we go. You're starting to get a really nice response on that contrast curve. If we pull the splines down, you can see the hair getting darker. And we can actually lift up if we want to bring a bit of a fade into those shadows. So again, very soft, subtle adjustments on the curves here. And we get a nice response on our image. Again, I'll just select all, middle mouse click onto that first frame, replace. Now we can go through our images and we can start to see, look at Lightbox because it gives us an overall view. Now we can see that contrast across all of our shots. And things are starting to look pretty good. So with that one very soft, subtle adjustment in our contrast, we can start to get a nice look across our shots. We've got our HDR palette here. And again, we have contrast and we've got pivot. So let me just go in here and set the 0.336. And now I can start dialing in contrast. So the thing with in our HDR palette, you can see the difference when we add contrast in our HDR. We don't get any response on the saturation. This is because our chroma values and our luminance values are separated in the HDR palette. The reason for this is in the HDR palette, generally you're making much larger contrast shifts. If the saturation was linked to contrast, it would just completely destroy anything in the brighter regions. So that's why we are working in a perceptually uniform color space here in the HDR wheels. Chroma and luminance have been separated. So if I do increase contrast in the HDR palette, I will have to increase saturation here to make up for any saturation that I need. So you can see that we've got that. Now, let me just copy that across. So you can see the HDR palette, it gives a different look again on the contrast. Let's bring up our vector scope here and have a look. So we can see this shot's nice. It's balanced. It's got orange in the skin tones and then it's got blue in the background for the ocean and the sky. So we've got this nice opposite colors on the color wheel. So already in this one scene, we're working on luminance contrast, but we've also got this nice color contrast in the scene between the orange skin tones and the blues. If I look at my skin tones line here, I can see the oranges are sitting off to the left of that skin tone line, pushing more towards the yellows. So in this case, I might actually just want to pull those skin tones just back to that line. See how I'm just like softly nudging the hue, and we're bringing those oranges of the skin tones, pushing them back to red. And because we're doing that on the hue slider, the blues in the back are also following around. So we keep this really nice opposite colors, contrasting colors. In this one scene, we've got luminance contrast between the skin tones, the hair, and the highlights. We've got color contrast between the ocean and the skin tones. And then what we can do is, if I go to my HDR palette, so let me just create a new node, and I'll just label that HDR. It doesn't matter if you do this in the color wheels or the HDR, I just do it in the HDR because I'm used to it. But we can actually start to pull up the mid-tone details. So what that's going to do is any mid-tone region, it's going to start increasing the perceived sharpness of any of those mid-tone regions. The highlights and the shadows are going to remain softer, and then the mid-tone region is going to get sharper. So another layer of contrast, you've got another layer of contrast in this scene. So already you've got 3 different layers of contrast from luminance, color, and sharpness. You can see how contrast can quickly play a very, very critical role in your color grading. So let me just pull these two, some just before and after. So you can see already there's, I've not really done a lot of work on this image, but you've gone from this, pretty flat piece of footage to something that's actually looking pretty good. So let's keep going. You could, in this case, let's just say we've got let's put a vignette on let's put a circle. Actually, let's just do it this way. Let's just grab a vignette from the effects, add it on there. Let's not do it that much. Let's just be a bit more subtle. Okay, we don't need to be so aggressive with it. Now we have added a vignette, and that's before and that's after. So another layer of contrast into our scene. So we're darkening the outer region and keeping the center region brighter. So contrast between the outer and inner region of the shot. There we have 1, 2, 3, 4 ways we can bring contrast into our image. to start to get a really nice effect and a really nice look on our shot. Now, I'm going to take it one step further and think about it this way. So for example, let's take this shot here. So what have we got here? We've got a very, very high contrast scene. Let me just copy this look into this. So I've just copied that across. So we've got these two scenes. Now, so what have we got here? We've got a very high contrast scene where we've got a backlit subject and the silhouette is dark. And then we've got the backlit where the sun is, which is quite bright. So we've got a very high contrast scene versus this scene, which is much lower contrast. So we do have contrast in the scene, but it's more evenly lit. So we're not backlit, we're actually in front, the sun's behind us, so the face is lit up. So if I am putting an edit together and I have these two shots back to back, there we have two contrasting shots in how the contrast in the shots are looks to our eyes. You can get so deep with this, like it seems like it's such a simple concept, but it actually just has layers and layers and layers. And this is just a few ways that you can actually work and learn contrast and start to bring it into your, when you're shooting, when you're out in the field filming, you can think about it. Then when you bring it into your software, DaVinci Resolve, you can think about it another way completely. So this is how I like to think about contrast, and especially with creative edits and when you're putting things together, like let's just say we've got these two shots, but you could basically have a match cut between those two shots. So you could have the lower contrast scene with the high contrast scene. You can actually think about it another way as well, because the background in this one is blue, the background in this one's orange. So that's another layer of contrast. So by thinking about contrast in this way, you can start to really have a very unique look in your footage, and it's something you should really pay attention to, especially when you're out filming, when you're editing. And I really love this Adobe color wheel, because it just helps, like for example, like let's say you're out filming on the grass, okay, and your subject is in the scene. If you put that subject in this like pinky purple color and have them stand on a grassy hill, you're going to get that really nice color separation and color contrast on the shot, and it's already in the footage, in the film. So then you can layer that with your lighting, your luminance, and then into the details like we talked about with the mid-tone details and the vignette. So color is just a great way to think about color. Let's just pull those blues up. So like the blue in this scene, like those lights in the back there, and then the orange in the front, you can see that they're complementary, like a blue and an orange. They're complementary colors. So they work really well. That's contrast. I'll put some free downloads and free products into the link below, so you can go grab those LUTs, and I've got some PDF docs for you as well, which you can go and download for free. Hopefully that gave you a better insight, maybe explained a bit of the theory behind middle gray, why we use it, how it relates to our eyes, how it translates into the video world, then how that all ties back to contrast, and then how contrast can be multi-layered as well. So hopefully that was useful, and hopefully I explained it correctly for you. But thanks again for watching. I appreciate it. Feel free to leave any comments below if you have any questions or anything that needs clarified, and I'll be happy to answer them. Get your downloads, get your free downloads, and yeah, enjoy your color grading journey. Thanks again, guys. I'll see you in the next video.